It's with great pleasure then that I can welcome our speaker this afternoon, who is no stranger to the Wesley Historical Society. Professor Bill Gibson is director of the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History, where the lecture is being held this afternoon, and also, of course, Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Oxford Brookes University. He's published widely on religion, politics, society, since the Restoration in 1660 and right through the long 18th century, with a particular focus and a particular specialism in the workings of the Church of England in that period. He's published widely. Hot off the press is a study of the bishops of the Church of England in the 18th century, the Anglican Episcopate from 1689 to 1800, published by the University of Wales Press, which is great to see. And in 2021, Bill also wrote a study of Samuel Wesley and the crisis of the Tory party between 1685 and 1720. And it's from that book, I'm assuming, that the subject of today's lecture grows and is a development and emerges. As you can see on the screen, Bill's title is John Wesley's Debt to His Father Samuel. Let's give Bill a warm welcome, and then over to Bill.
Thank you very much indeed, David. It's become one of the many myths of Methodism that the movement was heavily influenced by John and Charles Wesley's mother, Susanna. A check on WorldCat reveals that 270 books have been devoted in whole or in part to Susanna Wesley. Some of these explicitly suggest that she was, as is sometimes claimed, the source of John and Charles Wesley's evangelicalism and therefore of the Methodist movement. This is certainly the implication of Elsie Harrison's 1934 book, A Son to Susanna, and Mabel Brailsford's 1938, Susanna Wesley, a Mother of Methodism, a title also used by Mary Greetham's 2003 volume, and of course many others. Some of the books suggest that she was a source of religious radical influences on her sons. Works with this message include Donald Kline's 1980 work, Susanna Wesley, God's Catalyst for Revival, and Marion Field's 1998 work, Susanna Wesley, a Radical in the Rectory. The recognition of Susanna Wesley's role in the formation of Methodism was commemorated in Philip Atkinson's musical on Susanna's life called Dear Mother in 1989. And if any of you have any information on that musical, I'd be very keen to receive it. Susanna is also, of course, enshrined in a stained glass window in Liverpool Cathedral as Susanna Wesley, devoted mother. The celebration of the 350th anniversary of her birth in 2017 was a further occasion to acknowledge her influence. The conference at the University of Lincoln was titled The Bright Succession, after Susanna Wesley, Gender, Heritage and Faith, and showed some of the ways in which Susanna has been interpreted. Outwardly, of course, it's easy to compare Susanna's irregular prayer meetings in the kitchen at Epworth with John Wesley's later unauthorized field preaching. Perhaps Susanna Wesley's political resistance to her husband could be seen as an analogy for Wesley's relationship with the Church of England. And Susanna's upbringing in a dissenting household was perhaps also a model for how Methodism would turn out after John Wesley's death. Certainly, the fact that women made up a sizable majority of the early Methodist adherents seems also to imply a debt to Susanna. However, it's my contention that this is a reductive and misleading interpretation. As I've argued elsewhere, Susanna's theological and political views were inconsistent, if not incoherent. She may have had an influence on John Wesley's general spiritual values, but it seems implausible that her diffuse and conflicting views on other things had much influence. Her embrace of both non-juring principles and her recommendation of John Locke to her sons suggests that Susanna's political views were, at best, paradoxical. Moreover, the elevated view of Susanna's influence underplays the degree to which her husband Samuel had an impact on the ideas of John and Charles. And it's on this topic today that I want to talk, the debt of John and Charles to their father. It's clear that John, Charles, and their elder brother Samuel all held their father in considerable regard and esteem. In his father's last years, Samuel Wesley Jr. wrote a poem entitled The Parish Priest, which was clearly meant to be a portrait of Samuel Wesley. The opening lines were evidence that it was written from the perspective of filial duty. It began, "Accept, dear sire, this humble tribute paid, this small memorial to a parent's shade." Samuel Wesley Jr. Gave an account of his father as a parish priest, not of the pilgrim kind, but fixed and faithful to the post assigned. Through various scenes with equal virtue trod, true to his oath, his order, and his God. The poem was a rose-tinted, if not to say inaccurate, account of Samuel's life and work as a parson. It invented all sorts of things. Among them was the claim, repeated elsewhere, that Samuel Wesley had preached a sermon in 1688 in defiance of James II's Declaration of Indulgence. This was self-evidently untrue, since Samuel wasn't in holy orders in May 1688, and certainly didn't have a pulpit to preach from. In fact, as we'll see, Samuel was a strong supporter of James II right up to the Revolution of 1689. The poem romanticized, if not distorted, his relations with dissenters and the other parishioners, and ended with the encomium, "Steadfast, not stiff, and awful, not austere, though courteous, reverend, and though smooth, sincere, in converse free, for every subject fit, the coolest reason joined to keenest wit." It may have been a hagiographical retelling of Samuel Wesley's life, but it represented how his sons wished to imagine his life to have been, rather than perhaps how it was. So we need to separate Samuel Wesley as he was from the Samuel Wesley as he lived in his sons' imaginations. However, we can make an assumption that even in negative terms, Samuel Wesley had a significant impact on his sons' lives, since none of the three of them followed him into parish ministry. This is a quite remarkable feat, to have three ordained sons, none of whom decided to follow their father in holding a parish living. The 18th century clergy had a tendency to be a hereditary profession. One estimate is that half of the clergy came from the sons of parsons. And if grandfathers are included, that figure becomes a considerable majority. The three ordained sons of Samuel Wesley were the sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons of clergy on both sides of their families. Yet none of them, neither Samuel Jr., John, or Charles, adopted parish ministry as their vocations. Samuel Jr., of course, chose to be a schoolmaster, first as head usher at Westminster School for 20 years, and then as master at Blundell School in Devon for 6. He emulated his father in writing poetry, but he didn't want to discharge the duties of a parish. Neither John nor Charles ever received appointment to their own parish livings. John was briefly curate to his father at Root, near Epworth, for 2 years from 1726 to 8, but didn't hold a parish appointment thereafter. Charles was temporarily curate of St Mary's, Islington in 1735, but soon resigned when the congregation opposed his evangelical style of preaching. Both John and Charles, of course, had been missionaries in Georgia, but this doesn't seem to have encouraged them to pursue parish ministry as a lifelong career when they came back to England. It seems likely that the experience of their father as a Tory high churchman battling dissenters and low church opponents in his parish for nearly 40 years was sufficiently unattractive to deter them from seeking appointment to a parish. However much that his sons may have romanticized him after his death, during his lifetime they couldn't have ignored the evidence that Samuel Wesley's life at Epworth had been one of conflict, hardship, misery, and privation. His mismanagement of his personal finances and political conflicts ended in imprisonment in 1705, and his struggle with neighbours and influential churchmen created an environment of almost permanent crisis during the childhoods of Samuel, John, and Charles. Their father's cattle were maimed, his crops destroyed, his rectory burnt down 3 times. His correspondence with his bishop, William Wake, was full of recrimination and reproaches. Moreover, the relations between John and Charles's parents were tense, if not openly hostile. Susanna defied Samuel because she disagreed with his political views, and as late as the 1720s, she said she regretted her decision to marry him. John clearly didn't experience the breach of 1702-3, during which Samuel lived away from Epworth for 8 months. But the fragile truce that existed between his parents was probably evident to him and his brother. John Wesley acknowledged the tensions between his parents later in life. The haunting of the Epworth rectory in 1716 to 1717 by a ghost, old Geoffrey, clearly fascinated Samuel Jr. and John Wesley, and they wrote to members of the family asking about it for details. Of all the explanations that could be given for it, John's own in 1784 in the Arminian magazine was the most remarkable. John Wesley argued that the haunting was due to his father's breach of his oath in 1701 not to live with his wife while she defied him in her Jacobite political views. But in fact, Samuel returned to the parish, apparently without Susanna's explicit agreement to obey him. Wesley's conclusion was, quote, "I fear his vow was not forgotten before God, and this was the cause of the haunting." It was a bitter conclusion, and perhaps not one to bolster one's view of either marriage or parish ministry. So what debt did John Wesley owe to his father if he avoided the example of parish ministry and regarded his childhood as tense and fractious? It seems to me there are a number of ways in which we can see Samuel's influence in John's life. John Wesley's political principles, his churchmanship, his attitudes to money and use of writing, and ideas of marriage all seem to derive from Samuel rather than Susanna. And I want to take each of these in turn. Firstly, John's political views. Samuel Wesley's decision to conform to the Church of England in 1685 also marked a shift to strong Tory opinions. He abandoned the Whig association with dissent along with his dissenting principles. With the zeal of the convert, Samuel Wesley's Toryism became deep and wide. He went to Oxford 2 years after the Rye House plot had been discovered, which led the government and the university to declare certain Whig and Republican principles to be anathema. Tory Oxford taught Samuel Wesley that the subject's duty was to obey the king, and it was a sin to resist his rule. So Samuel remained committed to James II throughout 1688, even composing a poem of thanksgiving for the birth of the new Prince of Wales in June 1688. The revolution of 1688 to 9 must therefore have been difficult. And although he accepted that William and Mary were the legitimate monarchs, unlike Susanna, he never reconciled himself to the political consequences of the revolution. Consequently, Samuel resented the Toleration Act and regarded dissenters as schismatics. Schism, in Samuel Wesley's view, was a great sin, a temporal dismemberment of the body of Christ. In his parish, in convocation, and in public debates, he challenged the legitimacy of the Whig Revolution and sought to roll it back. He became a tribal Tory. For example, despite his urge to be involved with the Societies for the Reformation of Manners, to which he preached a sermon before one of the societies in London, he soon responded to the warnings of the Tory Archbishop Sharp of York and abandoned the societies. Sharp's objection was that the societies were dangerous since they were a mixture of Anglican and dissenting members. Wesley abandoned them in favour of an Anglican-only parish society. A generation later, John Wesley found some of his father's Tory allies, such as Henry Sacheverell, deeply distasteful, and John reconciled himself to the Whig regime of George I. Samuel had introduced John Wesley to Sacheverell in 1719 in the hope that Sacheverell would use his influence in Oxford to ease John's entry to Christ Church. In fact, John Wesley and Henry Sacheverell didn't get on, and John Wesley felt deeply insulted when Sacheverell said he didn't have good enough Latin and Greek to enter Christ Church. Wesley certainly didn't intend to take lessons from someone like Sacheverell, who had come close to challenging the legitimacy of the Revolution of 1688 and of the Hanoverian succession. Despite his reservations regarding extreme Tories like Sacheverell and his own support for the Hanoverian succession, John Wesley saw himself and proclaimed himself a Tory high churchman. He said, "I am a high churchman, the son of a high churchman, bred up from my childhood in the highest notions of passive obedience and non-resistance." Henry Rack commented of this that John Wesley seems to have adopted his father's Hanoverian Toryism rather than his mother's religious Jacobitism. Wesley's refusal to embrace his mother's Jacobitism was marked and robust. His attack on Jacobite principles led him to some quite extraordinary statements. In his concise history of England in 1771, Wesley countered the suggestion that the Hanoverian dynasty was alien to Britain. He did so by emphasizing that since they were descended from Matilda, the 12th century daughter of Henry I, unlike the Stuarts, the Hanoverians could claim long descent from the medieval monarchs of England. It was a remarkable contention and one that's testimony to John Wesley's virulent anti-Jacobitism. Moreover, John Wesley, in his concise history, claimed that one English king stood out as easily the worst ruler in history. That was Charles II. His detestation of the Stuarts was as fierce as his mother's support for them. In 1785, defending his older brother Samuel from claims that he was a Jacobite, he wrote, "He was a Tory, so was my father, so am I. But I am no more a Jacobite than I am a Turk." Like a good Tory, John Wesley not only supported the state and the king, he also rejected the rule of King Mob and was outraged when, as he put it, cobbler, tinker, porter, and hackney coachman claimed to have a political voice. In his choice of university, Samuel was undoubtedly influential for Samuel, John, and Charles. All three went to Christ Church, Oxford, the home of Oxford Toryism. Samuel clearly laboured to ensure that they all went to Christ Church, pulling strings to get John admitted in 1720. Samuel, of course, had been to Exeter College, Oxford, but in a little-known fact, he also entered the University of Cambridge in 1694, when he incorporated at Corpus Christi College and took the degree of Master of Arts. Quite what lay behind Samuel Wesley's migration to Cambridge is unclear, especially in the light of the fact that by 1705, it was his old friends in Oxford who raised funds to get him out of the debtors' jail in Lincoln. Perhaps he felt it would be easier to obtain an MA there, or that the prevailing Whig atmosphere of the 1690s, it would be prudent to have links with the Whig university. But by the first years of the 18th century, he had reverted to his alma mater and wanted his sons to breathe the same Oxonian Tory air that he had done. John Wesley's strong high church Toryism is evident in his attitude to religious dissent. A key element in this was his stubborn refusal to abandon the Church of England. He said famously he lived and died a member of the Church of England. Schism, as his father called it, was beyond the pale for him. The Church was the only measure of religious authenticity and authority that Wesley felt could be relied upon. Anything else was unacceptable, and hence he refused to consider separation from the Church. Wesley also retained the Tory principles of non-resistance or passive obedience to legitimate authority. This is undoubtedly the source of his reversal on the issue of support for colonial America. Before 1776, he saw that there were legitimate political grievances for colonists in America. He accepted that the stamp tax was onerous. But once a gun was fired against the king and the lawful authority of the state had been resisted, he could no longer support the colonists. In a calm address to our American colonies, he argued the Tory case against raising a rebellion against the crown. Theologically, John Wesley was also indebted to his father. His was, as I said, a high churchmanship, and it drew on 17th century ideas of the sacred nature of the church and the priesthood, rather than the high church tractarianism of the 19th century. Wesley's sense of the historic claims of the church are one of the key reasons why he didn't abandon Anglicanism. It also enabled him to regard baptism and conversion as vital to salvation, and the Eucharist as important, but not to the exclusion of other sacraments. Wesley's high churchmanship was rooted in the idea of primitivity, an 18th century term for authenticity, and in the sense that closeness to the early church made Anglicanism the most genuine expression of Christianity. Revivalism was also a key element in high church Anglican, especially in forming religious societies to secure people in their faith and to propagate it. Revivalism was present in high church Anglicanism from the 1670s in the work of Anthony Hornick, and it can be seen in Wales in the first years of the 18th century. In this respect, John Wesley was representative of a continuing trend in Tory high church Anglicanism that saw revival as a key to salvation. Other clergy of this type can be seen in a number of bishops, but also among fellow evangelicals such as Griffith-Jones of Llanddowror. From his father, John Wesley also inherited a fairly chaotic approach to money. Samuel Wesley had been a poor manager of his income. Undoubtedly, he didn't collect anything like the full amount of tithes from his parishioners, and farmed the glebe land of the parish poorly also. Some of this was due to the withholding of tithes by parishioners who resented his inflexible approach to moral issues and religious toleration. But a significant element was also Samuel Wesley's own ineffectiveness in farming the glebe, and perhaps also in raising surplus fees. In both cases, his predecessor had chosen to use an agent, and as a consequence, raised much more money. Samuel Wesley dispensed with the agent and was reliant upon his own limited acumen to raise his income. The result of Samuel Wesley's decision was that a wealthy living like Epworth, worth over £200 a year, yielded perhaps only a third of its proper value, and as a result, the Wesleys grew up in poverty. From 1701, Samuel borrowed money heavily, first from clerical friends and later from political opponents. It was this that led him to jail in 1705. Samuel Wesley also badly mismanaged his brother's East India money, sent back to England for Samuel to hold, so that he handed over only a fraction of the true worth. Samuel Annesley consequently refused to leave any bequests to his brother-in-law. John Wesley was not as poor a manager of his money as his father, but he certainly adopted a relaxed attitude towards it. He embraced a view that God will provide. From 1726 to 1751, he had only a small income as a Fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford. Once it became clear that he could earn money from writing and from collections from followers, he was lax in accounting for it. And Wesley could rely on wealthy benefactors to support him too. Later in life, the bookroom stewards, who managed Methodist income from book sales and other sources, despaired of his financial practices. Money slipped through his fingers, all for worthy ends, but without a clear business or accounting method. John Wesley, of course, operated on a scale far beyond his father's, and this meant that the connection could develop new systems of funding, which, of course, Clive Norris has so well described. But both were at best unworldly in their attitudes to money, because money was a means, not an end. Samuel and his son both saw writing in a similar way. It too was a source of money, but unlike money, it was also an end in itself. Samuel Wesley's early volume of poems, Maggots, a maggot was an idea that you got in your head that you couldn't get out of your head, rather than a literal bug. But Maggots was quite consciously a way of raising funds. He wrote in the preface, "Why mayn't I have my chance as well as others? If I write silly enough, why mayn't my books sell as well as any Christmas tales or wonderments that has been clapped into fist since bills were first invented?" The same was the case with his contributions to his brother-in-law's magazine, The Athenian Mercury, in which Samuel owned a share. Some of his articles were frivolous, but most were serious and written to persuade readers to become more pious. He wrote a religious column which encouraged readers to ask questions and to raise issues which he could respond to. Among these, as we'll see, were questions about the supernatural and witchcraft. Samuel Wesley's later theological works, his 1893 Life of Christ, and his multi-volume history of the Old and New Testaments in verse, and his 1920s dissertation on the Book of Job, were written for an educated readership, but they were also dedicated to the right people with an eye to preferment. They were worthy, if indigestible, and none obtained the popularity of the writings of other 18th century churchmen, such as John Tillotson. One writer compared Wesley to Richard Blackmore, who was a byword for dullness. Wesley with pen and poverty beset, and Blackmore versed in physic as in wit, thought, though this of Jesus, that of Job may sing, one bawdy play will twice their profits bring. And had not both caressed the flattering crown, this had no knighthood seen, and that no gown. In other words, Blackmore didn't win a knighthood, and Wesley didn't get preferment. Nevertheless, Samuel Wesley had a clear purpose. Despite their relative indigestibility, Samuel Wesley hoped that the life of Christ and the history of the Old Testament in verse might be widely read and encourage piety. In fact, the scale of the works meant that few could afford them. The 1893 edition of the Life of Christ ran to 524 pages, and even when it was reprinted in 1697, it was 252 pages. His History of the Old Testament in Verse, which contained extensive woodcuts, was published in 2 volumes, each with over 350 pages. His History of the New Testament was at least only issued in a single volume, but was also over 350 pages. Neither of these last were reprinted. In terms of both making money and reaching a wide audience, Samuel Wesley's works were a failure, though his journalism in the Athenian Mercury was self-consciously popular. John's writings were, of course, much wider and more extensive, but with the same goals: to make money and to spread Christian teaching more widely. In the Wesley family, turning to writing was a natural means of expression of piety, as well as a way to earn money. John Wesley's books on history, geography, and all manner of other disciplines were often written to raise funds. John Wesley's ventures into serial publications, such as the Arminian magazine and his journal, took advantage of new forms of publication not widely available to his father. A new technology and means of transmission meant that John Wesley's work could occupy a middle ground between the lower chapbook type material of Samuel's Maggots and the Athenian Mercury, and the more rarefied market for Samuel's later work. John Wesley, in contrast, tended to occupy the middle of the market, where by the 1750s, the literate classes had disposable income. Wesley's greatest achievement, of course, was the Christian Library, a heavily abridged anthology of Christian classical writings from the 17th and 18th centuries. It included works by theologians such as Jeremy Taylor and Richard Baxter. Wesley's digest of these writers heavily boiled down the original text, perhaps keeping as little as the 1/10 of the source material. He carefully edited out content that he disagreed with, such as predestination. It was a recommended cycle of reading of practical divinity and an attempt to make piety and religious literature as clear as possible. Like Samuel's work, this was an elephantine project, but far outstripping his father's scale, running to 14,000 pages of material. In the short term, it was a financial flop. The print run was only 100 volumes. But in the long term, it was a clear statement of the seriousness of Methodism and of its debt to an antecedent body of theology. In this respect, John and Samuel were cut from the same cloth. An aspect of divinity on which Samuel and John agreed was the immanence of the supernatural. Both John and Samuel believed that God was close to the world and intervened in it to ensure his plan for humankind. He did this in all sorts of guises, some natural, some supernatural, such as portents and spirits. They also believed the devil was similarly involved in the world and that witchcraft and sin were ever-present dangers. Samuel Wesley preached against witchcraft in Epworth in 1716, when there were rumours of activity in the neighbourhood, and he clearly regarded old Geoffrey as a real and supernatural phenomenon. So did John Wesley. In an era in which God was more distanced from the world in the human imagination, Samuel and John Wesley resisted that movement. In 1762, John Wesley gave great credence to the Cock Lane ghost, more so than the rest of the Church of England. Wesley even sponsored a public debate between the Methodist John Moore and the Anglican Stephen Aldrich, the vicar of St. John's, Clerkenwell. The public examination of the existence of the ghost was largely due to the insistence of Wesley and the Methodists that it was real. In fact, of course, we know that it was a put-up job between a father and a daughter, and a complete hoax. Wesley's attitude to marriage were also perhaps due to his father. Samuel Wesley undoubtedly adopted the Tory High Church view that all authority came from God, and that just as the king was God's representative on earth, so a husband and a father were set over a family to rule and govern it. He did not expect to be opposed. A wife's role was to be an obedient helpmeet, albeit one with whom one hoped to live in harmony. In the bedroom, as elsewhere, a wife was expected to submit to her husband. Samuel Wesley's outrage that Susanna had been defying him when it came to accepting the revolution of 1688 was principally because she was not obedient to his judgment about the legitimacy of the king. His phrase, "If you and I have two kings, we must have two beds," captured the sense that Samuel believed Susanna had overturned the natural order in defying him as much as the regicides had done in executing Charles I. We don't know exactly how or whether Samuel and Susanna resolved their quarrel after Samuel's 8 months' absence from Epworth, but it seems most likely that Samuel gave Susanna her forgiveness, even though she didn't abandon her opinions privately. As indicated earlier, John Wesley ascribed the rectory ghost, old Geoffrey, to his parents' quarrel and to divine unhappiness that Susanna had not been truly obedient to her husband, and perhaps even that Samuel knew this but lived with her anyway. In John Wesley's eyes, therefore, not only was a husband to be obeyed and submitted to, but that not to do so had serious consequences. This experience didn't encourage John Wesley towards marriage. His flirtations in Oxford with Kitty Hargreaves and Sally Kirkham seem to have reflected his ambivalence. So did his experience with Sophie Hopke in Georgia. In that case, his desire to be married, but his reluctance to go through the process, led to a breach which in some ways resembles his father's response to Susanna. In February 1737, he told Sophie, who he had spent considerable time with as both tutor and pastor, that he would not marry her until his mission to the native Indians was complete. Wesley seems to have regarded this as an engagement and assumed Sophie's agreement. When a month later she announced her engagement to Mr. Williamson, Wesley was outraged. By the summer of 1737, when Sophie stayed away from his religious society meetings and had not undertaken the required preparation for the Eucharist, he refused to admit her to communion. This punitive model of both marriage and relationships is one which is redolent of Samuel's. Denial of communion and denial of presence were rooted in the same pattern. John Wesley's subsequent engagement to Grace Murray in 1748 was perhaps born of the sense that she had served him well as a nurse and was from a lowly family and therefore would be a compliant wife. His eventual wife, Mary Vizale, had also nursed him, this time from a badly bruised ankle. They were married in 1751 after just a week's engagement. Wesley's treatment of Mary was thoughtless. He didn't give up writing to and neating young women, and he didn't show her the affection that she wanted. When she found evidence of his emotional comments about the blessing of his correspondence with one woman, she was infuriated. Her frustration led to violence. On one occasion, she dragged John across the room by a handful of hair, which was witnessed by a servant. When Mary accused him of adultery, he left for Ireland saying, I hope I shall see your wicked face no more. The marriage lasted until 1758 when they were separated. after an attempt to reconcile came to nothing, Wesley wrote, "For what cause I know not, my wife set out for Newcastle, purposing never to return. Non eam reliqui, non dimisi, non revocabo. I did not forsake her, I did not dismiss her, I will not recall her." If we look beyond the lives of John and Charles Wesley, in 1768, the noted churchman Christopher Wilberforce became Bishop of Lincoln, a post he held for 16 years. In his time at Lincoln, he spent much of it bemoaning the separation of the Wesleyans, as he called them, from the Church of England. In 1873, he wrote a pastoral letter to the Wesleyans, which ran to 3 editions. In it, he advocated reunion and placed the responsibility on the Church of England. He also made claims that scandalized the Church. He wrote, "It has been alleged that the prevalence of Wesleyanism is partly due to the careless incapacity or immorality of some pastors of the Church. I fully believe it." But he defended the Church on exactly the same grounds that Samuel Wesley did in his debate with dissenters: its sacraments, liturgy, apostolic nature, and the sinfulness of schism. Wordsworth claimed that in Epworth Rectory churchyard, on the south side of the chancel, is the gravestone of John's venerable father, Samuel Wesley, 39 years rector of that parish, who, as the epitaph on it declares, died as he lived, quote, "in the true Catholic faith of the undivided and ever-blessed Trinity and the Godhead of Jesus Christ." On that stone, John Wesley stood and preached. "Brethren," Wordsworth wrote, "if your revered founder, John Wesley, were to rise from the grave, what would his feelings be? What would be his language? If he stood once more on his father's grave at Epworth, inscribed with that profession of faith to which I have referred." Wordsworth went on to cite all the assertions of John Wesley that he remained within the Church of England, and that, quote, "none who regard my judgments will ever separate from it." He emphasized that John's father viewed schism as a deadly sin. Wordsworth even went on to claim that John Wesley would not be a Wesleyan because Methodism had strayed so far from his and his father's principles. In a second tract on ecclesiastical legislation, Wordsworth again bemoaned the secession of the Wesleyans from the Church, an act, he said, from which we have not yet recovered. But like Samuel Wesley, he thought all of this derived from the ill effects of the Revolution of 1688 and the secession of the non-jurors from the Church. This was exactly what Samuel Wesley thought. In conclusion, what Bishop Wordsworth was identifying was how far Methodism had come from Samuel Wesley's conception of the Church, and to a considerable degree John Wesley's principles also. Wordsworth also saw that the edifice John Wesley had created was very much in the image of his father's ideals of a national church in which revivalism was central to the ministry of the clergy, and in which High Church Anglicanism was the means of salvation. Wordsworth saw that by the second half of the 19th century, Methodism had travelled far from the starting point. But that doesn't mean that John Wesley's debt to his father was inconsiderable. Quite the reverse. Methodism in the first half of the 19th century transformed itself from John Wesley's limited conception of it into a national denomination. As scholars rediscover the ingredients in John Wesley's thinking, it was from his father, not his mother, that they find most influence. So perhaps there should be less talk of Susanna as the mother of Methodism and more of Samuel as the father. Thank you.